Imagine a king so convinced of his divine right, so determined to rule without question, that he drove his kingdom into civil war. A monarch whose stubbornness would cost him not only his crown, but his head. This is the story of Charles I of England, one of the most tragic figures in British history. In the early 1600s, England was in turmoil. Questions of religion, power, and money simmered beneath the surface. At the center of it all stood Charles I, a man born into privilege yet destined for disaster. His reign would see Parliament and monarchy clash like never before, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest conflicts on English soil, the English Civil War. Today, we will step into the life of Charles I, tracing his rise, his fall, and his enduring legacy. Charles was born on November 19, 1600, at Dunfermline Palace in Scotland. He was the second son of King James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England after uniting the crowns of England and Scotland in 1603. Unlike his older brother Henry Frederick, Charles was a sickly child. He struggled with weak ankles and a stammer, which made him appear fragile and shy. People doubted whether this boy could ever lead a nation, but fate would soon intervene. In 1612, tragedy struck. Prince Henry, the heir to the throne, suddenly died of typhoid fever at just 18 years old. The shy, frail Charles was now the unexpected heir. At the age of 12, Charles left Scotland and joined his family in England. He was tutored in languages, theology, and courtly manners. Yet while intelligent, he lacked confidence in public speaking. This weakness would haunt him when facing Parliament in later years. Still, Charles grew into a serious and devout young man. He was deeply influenced by the belief in the divine right of kings, that monarchs ruled by God's will, not by the consent of Parliament or the people. Charles's father, King James I, often clashed with Parliament, setting an example his son would follow. Charles learned early that kingship was a constant balancing act between royal authority and the demands of the realm. In 1623, Charles, alongside his friend George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, made a bold attempt to secure a Spanish bride by secretly traveling to Madrid. The mission failed spectacularly. Instead of marriage, Charles was humiliated, mocked by the Spanish court, and forced to return home empty-handed. But soon fortune smiled on him. In 1625, Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess. Their marriage was politically controversial in Protestant England, but personally, it grew into a devoted love story. Charles and Henrietta would go on to have 9 children, and Charles remained fiercely loyal to her. On March 27, 1625, King James I died. At just 24 years old, Charles ascended the throne of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The nation greeted him with hope. But Charles was different from his father. He was quiet, reserved, and deeply religious. Unlike the flamboyant James, Charles preferred ceremony, ritual, and dignity. He believed kingship was sacred, yet beneath the calm exterior lay a dangerous flaw. Charles would not compromise. He saw Parliament as a nuisance, not a partner. This attitude would lead him down a dark path. As Charles began his reign, his determination to defend royal power clashed with Parliament's growing demand for influence. The seeds of conflict were sown. Soon England would be torn apart. The young king now wore the crown. But could he bear its weight? The struggle between king and Parliament was about to erupt, and Charles would refuse to bend. The crown was heavy upon Charles's head. In 1625, he became king. But with the throne came enemies, suspicion, and endless demands from Parliament. Almost immediately, Charles faced a storm. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic princess, alarmed Protestant England. Many feared she would influence Charles toward Catholicism, but religion was only the beginning. Parliament held the purse strings, and war was expensive. Charles needed money to fund military campaigns against Spain and later France. Yet Parliament, suspicious of his growing power, refused to grant him the funds he wanted. Tensions flared. Charles demanded obedience. Parliament demanded accountability. Each side dug deeper. Charles leaned heavily on his closest advisor, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham. To Parliament, Buckingham was arrogant, corrupt, and dangerously influential. He controlled military ventures and royal patronage, making powerful enemies. When Buckingham's failed wars against Spain and France drained the treasury, Parliament demanded his removal. Charles refused. His loyalty to Buckingham was unshakable. But in 1628, fate intervened. A disgruntled soldier named John Felton assassinated Buckingham. The people rejoiced in the streets. For Charles, it was devastating. His closest friend was gone. From that moment, Charles withdrew further into himself, trusting fewer and fewer men. Parliament, emboldened, demanded Charles sign the Petition of Right, a document limiting royal authority. It declared that the king could not raise taxes without Parliament, could not imprison people arbitrarily, and could not impose martial law. Reluctantly, Charles signed it, but in his heart, he rejected it. He believed his authority came from God, not from men sitting in Parliament. In 1629, Charles made a fateful decision. Furious at Parliament's resistance, he dissolved it and would not call it again for 11 years. This period became known as the Personal Rule, or 11 Years Tyranny. During this time, Charles ruled alone. No parliament, no opposition, only his voice mattered. But absolute rule came at a cost. To raise money without parliament, Charles turned to creative and deeply unpopular methods. Reviving old feudal dues, selling monopolies, most controversially, enforcing ship money, a tax traditionally reserved for coastal defense, now demanded from the entire nation. To many, this was tyranny. The king was bleeding his people dry. Charles also fueled anger with his religious policies. Guided by Archbishop William Laud, he pushed the Church of England toward more elaborate ceremonies and rituals, which looked dangerously close to Catholicism. Puritans, who wanted a simpler, more Protestant faith, were outraged. Some fled to the New World to escape persecution. Others stayed, their anger simmering. Charles's queen, Henrietta Maria, openly practiced Catholicism at court. To Protestants, this was proof of their worst fears, that the king was leading England back to Rome. By 1637, rebellion was brewing. In Scotland, Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book, sparking riots in Edinburgh. Scottish Presbyterians, known as Covenanters, rose in resistance. Charles had no choice. He needed money for war. And to get it, he had to recall Parliament. After 11 long years, the king and Parliament would face each other again. But this time, the conflict would not end with words. The battle lines were drawn. Parliament demanded reform. Charles demanded obedience. Neither side would yield. The struggle for England's future was about to erupt into open war. The king who silenced Parliament now had to beg for its help. And in that moment, England would march towards civil war. In the 1640, after 11 years of ruling alone, Charles I faced a storm he could no longer control. His enemies were everywhere, in Parliament, in the pulpits, and on the battlefield. When Charles recalled Parliament to fund his war against rebellious Scotland, he expected support. Instead, Parliament demanded reform. They wanted control over taxation, an end to arbitrary arrests, and curbs on royal power. Charles dissolved them in fury after just 3 weeks. But the Scottish army crushed his forces. Humiliated, he had no choice but to summon another parliament. This new parliament was different, bold, defiant. They immediately went on the attack, executing Charles's closest advisor, Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, for treason. Archbishop Laud was imprisoned. Parliament declared it would never again be dissolved without its own consent. For Charles, this was intolerable. His crown was slipping from his grasp. In January 1642, Charles took a desperate gamble. He marched into the House of Commons with armed guards, intent on arresting 5 members of Parliament who opposed him. But the men had fled. The chamber stood empty. Charles looked around and muttered, "I see the birds are flown." This act destroyed what little trust remained. London erupted in protest. Charles fled the capital, raising his royal banner at Nottingham. England was now divided. The nation split into 2 camps: Royalists, Cavaliers, nobles, Loyalists, and those who believed in the king's divine right. Parliamentarians, Roundheads, Puritans, merchants, and reformers determined to limit royal power. The war began in blood and fire. At the Battle of Edgehill, 1642, the first major clash, the outcome was inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, but the struggle was far from over. Parliament's forces, led by men like Oliver Cromwell, began to grow stronger. Cromwell built the New Model Army, a disciplined, God-fearing, and determined force unlike any England had seen. By 1644, the tide turned. At the Battle of Marston Moor, Parliament dealt a crushing blow to the king's army, and in 1645 at the Battle of Naseby, Charles suffered a catastrophic defeat. His letters were captured, revealing his secret pleas for foreign aid and his willingness to use Catholic armies against his own people. Trust was shattered forever. By 1646, Charles was a king without an army. He surrendered to the Scots, hoping for mercy. But the Scots, desperate for money, sold him to Parliament for £400,000. The king who once ruled by divine right was now a prisoner. But Charles was not done. Even in captivity he schemed, bargaining with allies, plotting new wars. His refusal to yield would bring England into a second civil war and bring Charles himself to the edge of the scaffold. The king who believed he ruled by God's will would soon stand trial before men, and the judgment would shake the foundations of monarchy forever. By 1646, Charles I was a prisoner. His kingdom was torn apart, his armies defeated. Yet still he would not surrender his belief in the divine right of kings. That refusal would seal his fate. Even as a captive, Charles plotted. He secretly negotiated with the Scots, promising to impose Presbyterianism in England if they restored him to power. In 1648, this deal sparked the Second Civil War. Royalist uprisings broke out, but Cromwell's New Model Army crushed them with ruthless efficiency. The people had bled too long. Now, the patience of Parliament and the army was gone. Charles had broken his word. He had started another war. For his enemies, there could be only one solution. In January 1649, Charles was placed on trial in Westminster Hall. Never before had an English king faced such judgment. The charge, high treason against the people of England. Charles refused to recognize the court. He declared, "A king is not bound to give an account of his actions but to God." But his words no longer carried power. The verdict was decided before the trial began. He was found guilty. On a bitterly cold morning, Charles was led from St. James's Palace to Whitehall. Thousands gathered, silent and tense. At around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Charles stepped onto a scaffold draped in black cloth. He wore 2 shirts, so the people would not see him shiver and mistake it for fear. He addressed the crowd calmly, declaring his innocence and his faith in God. Then he knelt, placed his head upon the block, and signaled to the executioner. With a single stroke of the axe, the king's head was severed. A gasp went up from the crowd. Some dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood, as relics of a martyr. England was now a republic. The monarchy was dead. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across Europe. To some, he was a tyrant who had brought ruin on his kingdom. To others, he was a saintly martyr who had died for his crown and faith. For 11 years, England became a commonwealth, ruled by Oliver Cromwell and the Parliamentarian cause. But the memory of Charles I lingered. In 1660, his son, Charles II, was restored to the throne. One of his first acts was to declare his father a martyr king. January 30th became a day of mourning in the Church of England. Charles I's reign changed the course of English history. His stubborn defense of absolute monarchy unleashed civil war, toppled a crown, and forced England to confront the idea that a king could be held accountable. The balance of power between monarch and parliament would never be the same again. Charles I believed he ruled by God's will, but in the end, it was men who judged him. His fall reminds us of a truth that echoes through history. Even kings are not above the law. If you found this story of power, pride, and tragedy compelling, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe for more journeys into the past. The crown of England rolled in the dust, but from that dust a new nation began to rise.